Today, the legal and justice systems face numerous challenges in terms of access to justice, in terms of efficiency, and many of these are things that we would define as wicked problems. Wicked problems are those that have no immediate answer and require strategies to be developed across different fields of endeavour. So, for instance, the problem of crime, which has been with us for a very long time, is something that we can't simply deal with by fixing the justice system or fixing the criminal law. There's a complex mixture of social systems that contribute to criminality and social problems as well, such as poverty, toxic masculinity, addiction, problems with town planning, corruption, allocation of public resources, deficits in education. There are so many different domains that produce that one concept of criminality, and it's not something that we can fix just by fixing the legal system or by fixing the law. This is where design thinking comes in. Design thinking is something that is become very much more prevalent in multiple fields, including public policy, in the world of politics and in development, and it's an area that it's a strategy that has become important for the law as well. And this video is here to introduce you to some of the basic concepts of design thinking and to get you thinking about the way that law and justice professionals, including criminologists, can really use design thinking as a part of their problem-solving toolbox. Design thinking is also a form of human-centered design, and that's important because systems are not naturally human-centered. They tend to be created for a particular purpose, and they pursue that particular purpose, and there isn't necessarily a stage at which you think about the people who have to use that system. And a classic example is drafting of legislation. While we want to create legislation that's efficient and is well written, there isn't any formal stage at which legislation or new systems of regulation go through a process of testing, as you would test an industrial design product or a new commercial product. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I mean, there are a lot of competing priorities and not necessarily a good set of tools until we come to design thinking to balance those priorities. And we also find that bureaucratic systems tend to take on a life of their own and tend to replicate themselves and tend to lead development that benefits the system itself rather than necessarily looking for those who engage with that system. And a good example of this, an example of an area in which design thinking has made major changes in some places, is the hospital. Many of you have probably had experience of hospitals as a patient or a visitor, and most people find hospitals very alienating and frustrating places. It's difficult to obtain information, it's very difficult to find the right person to talk to, and even navigating the architecture of hospitals often leads to labyrinthine mazes and the sense of feeling lost and displaced. And the result of this, apart from the poor experience of the people who use the system, unfortunately often leads to violence. And while violence against healthcare workers is indefensible, it is often the natural result of people who are already stressed being further frustrated and pushed into a system where they're not getting the answers that they need. Of course, when these systems are challenged, the response is always the first priority is health of the patient. But the problem with that is that that's not a mutually exclusive outcome, and there are ways in which you can actually include better interaction with the human parts of hospitals and still provide that best care. And the design firm IDEO has done a lot of work in this space, and for instance the Nemours Children Hospital that they helped design is an excellent example of how you can design a space not just for the needs of the hospital but also for the needs of the patient, particularly the information needs and the sense of navigation a person needs to be able to feel in control when they are interacting with something like a hospital. Obviously, this experience also pertains to the justice system. People are similarly affected when dealing with courts or even just dealing with simple regulatory authorities and bureaucracies where they feel lost, alienated, and lose that sense of control. So design work is going to be one of those important things that the legal system is going to have to embrace. And law graduates and criminology graduates who have skills and understanding in that area, of course, will be in demand. Design thinking, of course, has important connections to systems thinking, and we have another video on that topic in this set of videos. Systems thinking helps you understand the complexity of systems and the different ways in which different systems interact with each other. So clearly there is an important synergy between these different ways of thinking and problem solving. There is also strong connections between design thinking and sustainability in producing outcomes that emerge collaboratively out of a context and aren't imposed from above. And those kind of sustainable solutions are ones that are going to last longer because the people who are engaged in the process of developing it and have a sense of ownership over it. And they can also ask those important questions about how is this going to be sustainable in the long term. Now, CQ University is a part of the Ashoka University network of changemaker campuses, which means that we focus on social innovation as one of the core capabilities of our graduates, and design thinking is at the forefront of that area of innovation and provides different ways and different solutions to think about the major issues facing the world today. So for lawyers and for criminologists, we have to think about the interface between law and society and develop a more human understanding of how those things work. In terms of law reform and the development of better and more efficient legal systems, there are plenty of challenges that involve that element of human-centered design thinking, and also those elements of sustainability and of systems thinking. So we looked at the example of the hospital before, but also think about the number of different systems and subsystems that go into regulating safer roads. From the formal legal systems, from laws that regulate speed limits and drink driving levels and so on, from the physical design of roads, the design of cars. All right, so we've talked a lot about around the issue of design, but what is design? Unfortunately, it's one of those things we don't have an immediate answer to, but design is about creativity. It's about creative problem solving, and when we look at something like creativity, it's something we value, it's something we know it's important, but it's very difficult to tell someone to just be creative. So design provides a framework for creative problem solving and provides different strategies to think around problems and to reconceptualize problems. And it's very difficult to be creative on demand. And a lot of our cultural ideas we have around creativity either see that as some sort of inspiration or some kind of inherent capability that people have. Like, you're a creative person, you're a creative genius, these ideas just come to you. In reality, even great artists or composers or other creative people find that creativity comes from putting in the hard work, and it's mostly about developing skills, developing focus, thinking around those creative problems. So one of the first things about design is to put aside those myths of creativity and to start thinking about creativity as something that comes out of hard work, not out of a lightning bolt from the sky that strikes you with great ideas. Now, sometimes that inspiration will come out of that hard work, but you've got to be doing that hard work for that to come along. So design thinking is a set of strategies and techniques designed to structure that creative process and to implement it across a group of people. Almost all design thinking processes involve teams. They're not something an individual does by themselves. So the other thing about a creative process is that you need to be able to have a shared understanding and a shared structure and a shared agenda, and design thinking provides that. It provides a set of tools to help you go forward. So this diagram provides a list of the stages of design thinking. Now, there are lots of different versions of design thinking and lots of different descriptors for each of these stages, but this is a good one to start with, and it gives you a very quick overview of what the process is. So it begins with empathizing, and that is understanding the people that are involved in the context. It moves to a process of definition, where you collect data and develop options. And then it moves on to an ideation stage, where you develop your ideas more fully. Then, crucially, we move to a prototyping and testing stage, where we actually try things out with a small audience, and we try and test to see how effective these different options are. We sometimes run multiple prototypes to see. And the testing stage often then feeds back to an earlier stage, and we move back before we implement. And we run through this cycle multiple times, and we iteratively develop our solutions, which means we build on our successes each time. There's an adage in the design field, and multiple people claim ownership of it, which is, fail often and early. But it is that idea that failure is not a problem in design, and you want to fail before you've gone too far down a pathway and you've committed too much to a particular solution, because it is very hard to steer the ship in a different course if you've committed too heavily. So the idea of prototyping is to get the bugs out of a system early, and to be able to develop these ideas before you've actually committed a lot of resources or credibility in one particular idea. All right, I'll talk about each of those phases in a little bit more detail, but it's crucial to point out here that we don't tend to do this in the legal field at all. We tend to avoid empathizing at all, although we may have like a public submission round when we're looking at law reform. What we tend to move to is straight into the ideas of developing new systems of legislation. We often build them on the basis of old frameworks and old tools, but we don't really use any sense of testing in the law field. And that's something where we need to change, because new laws and developing laws is extremely expensive, extremely time consuming, and we really can't afford to have mistakes. And unfortunately, we often do make mistakes and create systems that don't do what they're supposed to do. All right, so let's go through some of those stages. First, let's look at the empathize stage. This is extremely important for human-centered design, and this involves actually understanding the people who are going to use the system. It seems like common sense, but it doesn't happen very often. And, this had its origins in product testing, and the idea that you actually gave a sample group of people your product and let them use it to see whether it was something that they wanted or was something that was effective for them. And we should be doing this with a lot of our social systems and helping to understand how people use them. Now, you've no doubt had experiences in many parts of your life where you've been involved in a bureaucratic system of paperwork and forms and procedures, and you just think, this has never been tested. No one's ever sat down and figured out whether this works or not. And that's likely to be true. So this is where empathizing is important, is actually seeing what people's experiences are and what their needs are. And there's a concept in the design field called co-design. And that's where, rather than seeing the people you're working with as subjects of research and subjects of inquiry, that you actually see them as partners and you actually work with them to create those solutions, and you actually value them. The other thing that's important here is the concept of user interface design. The concept of user interface design looks at the connection between people and the system or object that they use. So a lot of work goes into the development of websites, for instance, where you look at the patterns of use and look at the different ways in which individuals use a website to understand what their needs are. Now, the same should happen with legal systems and social systems. We should be putting a lot more attention into how people actually use and access those systems in order to understand the needs of developing those systems. The next stage is the define stage, which involves looking at the problem from different angles and gathering data to support the next stage of development. And again, we don't have necessarily very robust systems of gathering data about the ways our different laws work. And a lot of what we do is based on either the common experience or common sense or or received wisdom of how systems work, or on the experience where the systems break down and the systems, the situations where the systems are faulty. And we don't gather very good information on what works, on how it works, and what that experience it is. And this is also where I guess the systems thinking becomes helpful as well. When we look at the connections within a system, we look at the connections between that system and other system, and we look at issues like flow and how the different process and the pathways through which people flow through a system. And of course, if you have already seen or are yet to see the video on systems thinking, information flows are a very important part of this. And our experiences of bureaucracies are often the problem there is the information flows and the lack of the ability to get the information that you need. The next stage is to ideate, develop ideas, and that's where you need strategies to try and develop new ideas and to work on different ways of thinking about the conventional ways of doing things. I hate to use the cliches here, but the cliche about thinking outside the box, cringeful as it is part of this process. And it's this ways of being able to try and develop innovation. It's like all forms of creativity, it's very difficult to sit someone down and say, now, innovate, be creative. So we have different strategies. Now, some of these can be silly. Some of these are things like you go to events and they make you make things out of pipe cleaners and Play-Doh and things, and that's all a bit silly, although that may work for some people. But, issues, things like brainstorming and different sort of strategies for developing ideas are all important at the ideates or ideate stage. And here, in terms of legal development, we also bear in mind the legal design principles that are important here. So we have to bear in mind things like systems of rights and how they're important and how they can contribute in the way in which we develop our ideas and different ways of solving the problem. We have to think about things like access to justice and all those important issues as we go. The next two stages are connected, and that's the prototyping and testing phases, in which we develop a model and we test it out and see how it goes. And this very, very seldom happens at present within the justice arena. And it's something that's emerging as something that we're doing now. And it's emerging just out of practicality because it's a cost-saving thing. It costs money, of course, to develop a prototype, but you're going to save money in the long run because spending a lot of money developing a system that doesn't work or is inefficient creates other costs. Now, we sometimes do a sort of prototyping where we have pilot projects and pilot programs and things, but these are not often very rigorous, and this is something that we need to work on. And again, we're only starting to develop people with design thinking skills and to train people out of law and criminology with those skills. So this is something that's going to be an emerging field that's very important in those areas. So that prototyping and testing will happen often multiple times. Sometimes you'll run multiple prototypes at the same time and to evaluate them and test them against each other. Sometimes you'll run them in sequence, and every time you'll iterate and develop an improved version, an improved model. But what's important with the design thinking model is this happens before implementation, and that you spend a lot of time developing those prototypes before you roll them out to the general public. And then when you do implement them, implementation is not the end of the story, because at some point there's going to be another stage of design thinking, another stage of development. So you need to have systems and process by which you monitor your system once it's implemented. You collect data, you develop a better understanding. Hopefully it'll be quite some time before you need to redesign something, but then when you do, you've actually collected information along the way and you understand what those needs are for that next cycle of design and innovation. That's a very general introduction to design thinking methods. It has a lot of potential to impact on the law. It has the potential to develop more effective regulators, to enhance people's overall sense of fairness, and to decrease the amount of frustration people have in a system. And all of these are going to have a bottom line cost saving at the end of the day. These are things that are, at the end of the day, going to create a system that is more sustainable and less costly to implement. Even in individual organisations, and law offices and firms and community organisations, there are improvements to be made through innovation. And overall, this approach creates less conflict, less friction, and that's going to have broader impacts for your organisation, for your clients, and society generally. So design thinking provides a lot of different good and beneficial outcomes. It's not something that's beyond criticism, and as you progress further in your studies, you'll learn more about the pros and cons of it, but it's an important thing to be aware of. And if you want to look at some really practical examples of where design thinking can be used, have a look at the Australian design firm Portable and their website portable.com.au, and there are plenty of examples there of how they, as designers, have worked with government to improve access to justice.